Hello. So great to see you all again. Welcome to our program for the History Happy Hour. My name is John Kennedy, and I will be your host for tonight. All right. I'm John Kennedy, and I'm the Specialist of Education and Engagement at the Indiana Historical Society. I will be going over a few pieces of logistics before passing the mic over to our speakers. At the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana storyteller connecting people to the past. We collect paper-based items such as books, paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, and more to tell Indiana's unique stories. We then find ways to share these stories through publications, exhibits, and events such as this one. Through these documents, we tell the diverse stories of Indiana and inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. Tonight, we're here for a conversation regarding the history of Freemasonry in Indiana. I'm sure many members of our audience are familiar with the site of their lodges throughout the state, and maybe more of our guests tonight are members of the Masons. We're joined right now by Michael Broomback, the former Grand Master of Masons in Indiana and Vice President of the Masonic Library and Museum. Thank you for joining us, Michael.
Thank you.
And we are also joined by Chris Hodapp, the President of the Masonic Library and Museum and author of Freemasons for Dummies. Thank you for joining us, Chris.
Thanks very much for having me, John.
Before I hand things over to our guests, just a few more pieces of logistics to cover. For this event, I will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you have questions as we go along, please drop it in the question and answer section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll keep an eye on them and then pepper them in as we get to the second half of the program. If you'd like to add anything to the chat box, don't forget to change your response to everyone so we can see your thoughts. Keep an eye on the chat where I'll be dropping in links and URLs throughout the conversation. Don't worry if you miss one, it will be delivered to your inbox in a follow-up email tomorrow morning. This program is being recorded, and you can catch the replay on our website, indianahistory.org, in the coming weeks. If you enjoyed this program, please consider coming back for more. Our next History Happy Hours continue on August 18th, where we will be talking with Tamara Hemmerline about the history of the written word. Our next one after that is in September. On September 15th, we'll be discussing Indiana and the Cold War with our guest, Zoe Vorndren. And you can stay tuned for more of our virtual programming and also our in-person events over at indianahistory.org. All right, so I think probably the first question which we are going to have is going to be, Chris, can you tell us a little bit about Freemasonry?
Sure, absolutely. Freemasonry is the world's largest, oldest, and probably best known fraternal organization and so-called secret society. It began as a fraternal group, almost like a labor union kind of organization, the craft guild in Scotland and in England, dating back until about before the year 1000. And there are early documents that talk about their meetings and their codes of conduct and that sort of thing. And then in the 1700s, it transitioned into a fraternity that brought in gentlemen that didn't know the first thing about actually building cathedrals or bridges or castles or anything else. And the fraternity uses the symbolism and the terminology of building buildings, particularly sacred buildings, as symbols for making a better man, constructing a better man, a person of conscience, a person of faith, a person of good actions, responsibility to the community. And so it really grew from that and began to spread very quickly throughout England and Scotland and Ireland, and then eventually into the colonies. Very, very quickly, it spread around the world.
That's very interesting. And if I'm not mistaken, several of the founding fathers of the United States were also Masons themselves.
Yes, that's absolutely true. It turns out that 14 American presidents have been members of the Freemasons over the years. Many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution were members of the Masons. Much of the revolutionary activity, the precursor to the revolution breaking out in Boston, took place with members in both on the English side and on the American side in Masonic lodges there. And so, yeah, it's Freemasonry has been part of the United States before there was a United States.
And if I'm not mistaken, also Masonry played an important part with the signing of the Indiana Constitution.
Yes, it did. When Indiana became a state, 1816, 1817, it had a semblance of a constitution that was adopted, but they really needed to sit down and put together a very formal document that took more time and deliberation and input from the actual citizens in the state. And so in 1851, the Freemasons had just completed building their first very large Indianapolis Masonic Temple building and headquarters to the Grand Lodge of Indiana. And before the building even opened, the General Assembly came to town, and they couldn't all fit in the same building together over at the State House, along with all the delegates for the Constitutional Convention at the same time. So the Masons opened our doors and said, "You're welcome to meet here." And they hashed out the Indiana Constitution in Freemasons Hall in Indianapolis.
I actually think we have a couple slides which we could show our audience that involves Freemason Hall and also a couple other famous sites throughout Indiana. So this is the current symbol for the museum.
It's actually it's a coat of arms that in a very small image helps to trace the origins of Indiana Freemasonry. You have symbols that are from Scotland and England. You have images of the building trade. You also have images that had to do with the official seals of the Grand Lodge of England, the Grand Lodge of Scotland, Grand Lodges of Virginia and Kentucky and Pennsylvania and Ohio. All are included in that one little image to help sort of trace our family tree, as it were, for the founding of the Grand Lodge of Indiana in 1818, which was done down in Madison. There's a building there called the Schofield House, which was actually an inn that had just been built in Madison. And in 1818, in January of 1818, we met there. There were a total of 9 lodges, and they were chartered from mostly Kentucky, but also from Ohio. And they turned in their charters to the original Grand Lodges that issued them and formed a new Grand Lodge of Indiana at that time. And so it grew from there.
And I believe this is the original Masonic Hall in Indianapolis.
Yes, it is. That was the one that the Indiana Constitution got hammered out in before it even officially opened to the Masons. The Indianapolis Masonic Hall, the first one there, became very important to the community very, very quickly because it was the first real community auditorium that was made available to the city. I mean, you got to remember, at the time this was built, you were just barely 10 years beyond having tree stumps in the middle of a muddy field along what was to be Washington Street, which is barely navigable at that time. And yet here it is in 1851. And we have the first real public venue. You had theatrical groups that came. You had public speakers. You had famous authors would come and give literary readings. There'd be musical recitals and concerts. There were political conventions held there. 2 churches had major fires in the city, and they didn't have anywhere to meet. And so the Freemasons turned over that assembly hall on Sundays to the churches. So yeah, it became very, very important to the community very, very quickly.
And I believe this is more footage of that same hall.
This is about 1867 or 68, and this is you see the front of it over there on the right hand side, and the fixtures growing off the columns. It was the first building in the city of Indianapolis, first public building in the city of Indianapolis that had gas lights, and so it really stood out. They lit up the whole front of the building, so you can see it at night.
Yeah, it's amazing that this hall has not just been here since the beginning of our state as a proper state and not just a territory, but also just seeing how it has slowly changed. I mean, we have electric lights these days.
Now, what's interesting is that building and the one that will follow it in the 1870s were built on the corner of what is now Washington Street and Capitol, where the Hyatt Regency is today. And they chose that spot deliberately because it was straight diagonally across the street from the State House. And so many Masons were members of the General Assembly and the Indiana government. And so they wanted to take that, they wanted that pride of place right there on the corner across from the State House symbolically. And in fact, today, if you go down to the State House, there's a statue of George Washington dressed as a Freemason on the south side of the State House, looking out over, predictably, Washington Street. And so, yeah, it was a very deliberate choice. So that one and the building that followed it were built on that corner. And then in 1909, it moved up to the corner of North and Illinois streets, just south of the big parking lot where the Scottish Rite Cathedral is today.
So breaking away from the slides for a second, can you tell us more about like the history of the current lodge, I believe, or the current museum? That's the building you were just talking about, correct?
The museum is actually located inside of that temple building. Was built in 1909, the new Indianapolis Masonic Temple and Indiana Freemasons Hall. That building replaced those first two. There was a major fire in the early 1900s that destroyed the second building. And so they moved to that lot at the corner of North and Illinois streets. When that building was built, our present building was built, it was built with 4 Masonic Lodge meeting rooms, which also had, each one had its own very large social room across the hall. And so our museum today is located on the 5th floor in the social room of one of the lodges that was there. Originally it was built, it's got 7 different ceremonial rooms in it, 4 Masonic lodges, and 3 ceremonial rooms for what's called the York Rite. And it's got a ballroom on the top floor. It's got a major dining hall on the 2nd floor. There's a 700-seat auditorium that almost no one in the city knows anything about. And so, yeah, it's quite a place.
So you mentioned the York Rite and the Scottish Rite. I know that you probably can't go into too much details about them, but what are these rites and their significance in Masonic culture?
Well, only because we've got a short program here and they can become very complex descriptions, but the York Rite and the Scottish Rite are both basically a series of continuing Masonic degrees. The lessons that are taught by Freemasons are taught as in like little morality plays, and the candidate for the degrees of Masonry takes part. He's a participant in those ceremonies, and so the York Rite and the Scottish Rite are additional ceremonies. You go for the first 3 degrees in your local Masonic lodge, the lodge you'll find down on the street corner, and then you have sort of centralized locations for the larger groups, the Scottish Rite and the York Rite, that have multiple degrees to go through as well. And they all require their own ceremonial spaces and requirements for those rooms as well. They're called appendant bodies, appendant groups. They include the York Rite, the Royal Arch, the Cryptic Council, the Knights Templar you may have heard of, and the Scottish Rite. If you've heard of 32nd or even 33rd degree Masons, those are part of the Scottish Rite as well. But they need to be understood that the first 3 degrees of Masonry are the most important ones you will ever take. Just because someone says, I'm a 32nd or I'm a 33rd degree Mason and a Knights Templar, that doesn't matter. You don't outrank anyone by saying that. They're not more important degrees or of greater honor. They're just additional organizations and lessons you can learn.
Okay. So just describe, you said to mention the museum is on the 3rd, you said the 3rd floor?
No, it's on the 5th floor.
5th floor.
Yeah.
So which is basically the museum, what might one see if you walked into it?
Well, let me throw you to Mike Brumback, who can tell you a little more about the museum. We've both been involved with it since it moved back to Indianapolis from down in Franklin 10, 11 years ago. And Mike has things to say about that.
Oh, Mike, what can you tell us about the museum?
Well, let's start with the slide with the two nice looking young ladies.
All right, let me. I'm bringing that up right now. And here we go.
So while he's bringing that up, we moved from Freemasons Hall to Franklin, where we have our Masonic home in the mid part of the century. And then in 2009, we moved everything back to Indianapolis, thinking this would be a much better location for the general public to be able to come. And we really didn't get much accomplished until 2011, when they asked me if I would step in and help out and revitalize the museum. And they thought I knew how to build a museum, but I really didn't. But I did know how to find people that did. So I went to Indiana University, and they were nice enough to give me two interns that were studying to get a master's degree in museum studies. And here they are, Emily and Kate were our first two interns. And in 6 months' time, they turned what we termed as more of a garage sale into a real museum. And if you would move forward one slide, you will see the foyer to that museum now. We have now had 17 interns from Indiana University Museum Studies. We'll have 2 for this coming school year, but we're very proud of the fact that we have mentored now 17 young people getting master's degree. So this is the entrance to the museum, and it's the foyer when you get off the elevator or come up through the grand stairway that comes up through the middle of the building. This is what you would see, and this has a few changing exhibits in the foyer. And then the next slide will show you what you will see when you open the doors to the museum. So we have typical museum cases. We have couches where guests can sit to read, because we do have a library as well. But you can see on the back wall video screens. So we have audio video presentations, and then a number of exhibits displayed in the museum. Now, would you like me to talk about some of the specifics, or do you have another question for me?
I would actually love for you to go into specifics, but I have one quick question involving this slide,
Sure.
which I only just noticed. The background says Brother Colonel Sanders. He was also a member of the Masons, the
Yes.
Freemasons.
So when we'll get to a slide with another Freemason, but Colonel Sanders from Henryville, Indiana, most people think of him as from Kentucky Colonel Harlan Sanders, but he was actually a Freemason from Indiana. So just one of many, and I'll highlight some more as we get to another slide.
Okay.
But good observation. So the next slide you see is aprons. And one of the keynote things that we have in our exhibit are Masonic aprons. So we rotate aprons on a regular basis, and the aprons you see here are all aprons from the late 1800s to very early 1900s. And while they are similar, they're all handmade, so they're all unique. And some of these aprons are just aprons that a Mason owned and has come down to us as an artifact, and others have a story. So if we move to the next slide of an apron, this apron has a story. This apron belonged to William Polk, the brother of James Polk, President of the United States. This apron is handmade. It was actually hand-drawn by a niece of William Polk in the mid to late 1700s. And he was a Mason in Tennessee. And we have the good fortune to have this passed down to us for our museum. But here is an example of a handmade artifact, and it demonstrates the importance that Freemasonry had for many, many famous people at that time, that they would go to the trouble to have these customized, handmade aprons to wear to their lodge meetings.
It's very beautiful. I love actually just the elaborate stitching that's put into it.
Yes, but it's a silk apron, but that is all hand drawn. That's painted literally on the silk. And it's in remarkably good shape. We're very fortunate to have been able to preserve that. If you turn to the next slide, we have another example of a slide or of an apron with a story. This apron belonged to Joseph Davies, who was Grand Master of Kentucky in 1811. Now, as you well know, Indiana didn't become a state till 1816, but in 1811, there were already lodges in Indiana. One lodge in Vincennes was actually formed in 1809. And in 1811, Colonel Davis came to Indiana, joined William Henry Harrison's regiment, ultimately to fight at the Battle of Tippecanoe. But he wrote the lodge in Vincennes and says, as your Grand Master, I'd like to visit you. I'm bringing a friend with me, and I would like to have him receive the degrees of Freemasonry. And I'll be there prior to joining my regiment. And he led a company of dragoons. This is the apron that he brought with him. This apron came to Indiana in 1811, but we believe the apron to be much older than that. In fact, we believe the apron actually came from Virginia through his family. Why we're so fortunate to have it, he took this apron with him when he went on to form his regiment. He fought in the Battle of Tippecanoe and was killed in that battle. His regiment returned this apron and his sword to the lodge because they had such a high regard for Freemasonry and knew the colonel was a very loyal Freemason, being the Grand Master of Kentucky. We retained the apron for our artifacts. We returned the sword to the Grand Lodge of Kentucky, and that's one of their proud artifacts as well. So this apron, we are very fortunate to preserve and had reconserved by someone from the Smithsonian, because it was in rather poor shape when we got it. And they have done an excellent job of preserving and conserving this apron for future generations.
All right, moving on to the next one. I actually don't know what this is.
John, can I interrupt real quick?
Sure, go ahead.
One thing that many people in the audience may be wondering about is we always go on and on about aprons, and a lot of people who aren't Masons don't get that. They don't understand, what in the heck are you guys about wearing aprons for? And it's because they are symbolic. When you go through your Masonic degrees, a Masonic apron is patterned after a actual stone workman would wear leather aprons to protect their clothes from getting filthy with working with cut stones all day long. Well, in our teachings, we teach that you receive, when you become a Mason, a white lambskin apron, and it's a symbol of your life, of your conscience, of your behavior in life. And you're supposed to keep it pure and spotless as the day you first received it, by leading a good life. And so it's a symbolic thing. And yes, every time we open a meeting, all of our members wear these aprons. And over the years, they become very, very decorative. So that's why aprons are important to us.
No, that's good to know. They become more decorative as you get more ranks.
In most cases, they get more decorative as you become fascinated by symbology, and you find, people 300 years ago were just as susceptible to wanting something because it was really cool. The concept of really cool bling is not a new one. And so you will find that in many Grand Lodges, they will technically tell you, well, you're not supposed to have any decoration at all on an apron unless you're an officer. of a specific lodge, and then you can have an officer's apron, and then they'll turn right around and buy a very decorative one that they found somewhere. So yeah, it's something that we delight in, and don't always follow the rules to the letter, because there's some really cool aprons out there.
By the way, for our audience, in 15 minutes, we're going to be opening up to some questions. Feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of our Zoom screen. And moving on, I guess, to another question, or I scroll right past what I had written down. So we mentioned just like, symbols and a lot of like, the symbology involved with being Masons. And I've noticed that it's the compass and ruler symbol pop up a lot. Do you want to expand on that for our audience who may not be familiar with it?
Well, it's the square and compass, and those are operative tools that a Freemason operating in a guild would have used to build a building or construct a bridge. So we use those today to measure our work morally and teach moral lessons to our candidates. The same way the apron also comes from the operative craft. When they were building buildings and cutting stone, they wore aprons to protect their clothing. They wore leather aprons. We wear them strictly symbolically today to connect ourselves to the operative stonemasons and to distinguish ourselves within the lodge.
Okay. Did you want to talk more about?
To your question about the symbol, the square and compass forms a symbol that we use as our main logo or icon for our fraternity. And in the middle of those be the letter G, and that stands for the trade secret of Freemasonry, which was geometry. But it also serves for God, because they were building houses of worship. You couldn't be a heathen. You had to be a believer. You had to believe in God to be a Freemason, and you still must believe in a God to be a Freemason today. So the G is to remind us of that as well. Now, your next question.
My next question was, did you want to go back to more of the slides about the exhibit?
Yeah, let's go to the next slide, which is a stone. And you had asked about famous Freemasons, and in fact, weren't many of the founders and presidents. This stone is given to us by President Harry Truman, and he discovered when they restored the White House during his term of office that the operative Freemasons, who were from Scotland, that built the White House, they had left their Mason's mark, a geometric symbol carved in stone, in the rough foundation stones of the White House, kind of as a Kilroy was here. They really didn't intend for anybody to ever see it again, because it was literally buried. But when they excavated to redo the White House, they discovered these Mason's marks carved in stone. And Harry Truman, a past Grand Master of Missouri, and now President of the United States, had them removed and the stones cut into smaller pieces just big enough to display the symbol, and sent one to every Grand Lodge in the United States. And here's the one he sent to Indiana. There's a little brass plate on it, and in the picture frame is the letter that came with it, signed by President Truman, with, again, a little brass plate on it. And that letter is in a pretty plain frame, but the wood from that frame is made from the floorboards of the White House. So it, in fact, was an artifact as well. So there were, in fact, 14 presidents of the United States that have been Freemasons, beginning with George Washington and the last being Gerald Ford. So 14 out of the 46. So about a third.
That's pretty, like, a large number. We've had 45 presidents, 46 now, 46 presidents.
Thank you.
So
I thought I was wrong for a second.
So that's pretty, it's a pretty sizable amount who are Masons.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit just about just Truman's involvement with the Masons?
I'm sorry, say that one more time, John.
Can you just tell us more about President Truman's involvement with the Masons?
Yes, Truman was Grand Master of Masons in Missouri prior to being a senator. Uh, and he was a very loyal Mason. In fact, he attended many Masonic functions as president. But in Indiana, we're very proud of the fact that he attended degree work in Beech Grove Lodge on the south side of Indianapolis. And he did that while campaigning for re-election, an election he wasn't expected to win. That's the election where he holds up the paper saying Dewey wins, because they thought it was unlikely. They thought he had not won the election. But while he was campaigning in Indianapolis, he had a young man that was assigned to him as a physical therapist. Harry had a bad back. Not many people knew that, and that was kept somewhat secretive. But this young man was from Indianapolis. He and Harry talked about Freemasonry. This young man joined the lodge in the south side of Indianapolis, Beech Grove Lodge, and they invited the president to attend his Master Mason degree. He first said he couldn't attend because his campaign schedule was too full, but at the last minute, he decided he wanted to come for the second section of the Master Mason degree if they would hold that off till about 9:30. And he arrived about 9:45 at Beech Grove and attended this young man's Master Mason degree. So here was the most powerful man in the world, took time out of a very important campaign schedule just to attend the Masonic degree of a young seaman who was in the Navy. Don Bauermeister was his name, became a dentist in Indianapolis. That happened right here in Indianapolis.
Especially considering what that's 3 years after the war. And
Yes.
you mentioned during his reelection campaign, and the fact that he just took that request so like sincerely. And I think that's actually, he showed up just at 9:45. So I can only imagine that they were just waiting patiently for him. No, but that's a really cool anecdote.
Not only that, he had officially turned down the request, and at the last minute decided he wanted to go. And the Secret Service was not happy about this because they'd not been there, and they did not have a Secret Service agent that was a Mason. After that event, they always had a Secret Service agent that was a Mason, because the Secret Service had to wait downstairs in the dining room, but the president told them he'd be just fine upstairs with his brothers. So the president went upstairs unescorted by Secret Service.
I just think that's actually an incredible, just the fact that the Secret Service was like, no, you need to have a bodyguard with you. And he's like, then make one of my fellow brothers a member of the Secret Service. And a really good workaround.
And the Secret Service wanted this to be a secret. And when the president got to Beech Grove, there were something like 1,000 people in the street that couldn't get into the lodge hall because it was too small. So it was apparently not much of a secret, also a concern to the Secret Service.
There are all kinds of fascinating things about Truman. Before he was named as FDR's vice president, he was just the senator from Missouri. He became the 33rd president. He was a 33rd degree Mason. This is usually when the spooky music starts to play. But he was a very, very big promoter of the fraternity. During World War I, he was in foxholes trying to encourage guys when they went home to go join a lodge. And then when World War I ended, he helped to form an organization called the Masonic Service Association, which was done so that all 50, eventually 51 of the Grand Lodges in the United States could cooperate on a common program together, because they wanted to help during World War I, and the military department went, look, we can't deal with 51 of you guys. Come up with some kind of a thing you all want to do together, and we'll consider it. And so before World War II, Truman helped spearhead an effort to go into every major town and find out if there was a very large Masonic building there. And they identified all the towns in America that had bigger than normal Masonic halls. And then as World War II starts to, before Pearl Harbor, but as it's looking like we're getting closer and closer to getting involved, they set it up. So this is the beginning of the USO and other service clubs. And so the Masonic Service Association formed these clubs that were like USO places, but they were in Masonic halls. In Indiana, the one in Indianapolis and the one in Evansville were both used, and they provided, writing material, free phone, long distance phone calls, transportation for soldiers. They got a 3-day pass. They would go get the guy and bring him to town. His parents would come. They'd meet his parents at the train station and find somewhere for him to stay. It was really an incredible nationwide effort done by the Masons, and largely at Harry Truman's insistence and very active hand.
So we mentioned the Beech Grove Lodge, and we've mentioned how Truman visited here. And we also mentioned briefly about the Colonel earlier, Colonel Sanders. Are there any other famous Hoosiers who are members of the Freemasons?
Absolutely. If you would bring up the slide about Dave Thomas.
All right, 1 second.
It's got some hats, a fez, and a picture. Next slide after that. Next slide after that. There we are. Dave Thomas of Wendy's, from Fort Wayne, Indiana, belonged to Saul D. Bayless Lodge. Here's the connection between Dave Thomas and Colonel Sanders. Colonel Sanders sold a franchise to the restaurant Dave Thomas was frying hamburgers at in Fort Wayne called the Hobby House. And now he's frying chicken. And the Colonel literally negotiated a deal for him to become the manager of a store in Ohio, a restaurant. And he became a part owner of that restaurant, again, with the Colonel's help of how to negotiate that. And he sold his part in that restaurant to get his grub steak to found Wendy's. So Colonel Sanders and Dave Thomas have a connection, and they're both Indiana Masons. The rings you see there in that picture, when Dave Thomas became well known and well-to-do from Wendy's, he bought himself a very nice Masonic ring with a large diamond, and he bought one just like it and gave it to his old mentor, Harlan Sanders. Dave never wore his ring in his commercials, which he kind of patterned after the Colonel as well, being the spokesman, but Harlan Sanders wore his ring very publicly. So Harlan Sanders, Dave Thomas, Red Skelton, Gus Grissom, one of the original astronauts, and the list goes on and on. There are numerous famous Freemasons from right here in Indiana.
I knew that Dave Thomas was, a fellow Hoosier. I just did not know his link with Harlan Sanders.
That is not a well-known story, although he publishes that in his autobiography.
By the way, for our audience, we're about 3 minutes away from opening up to our question and answer segment. So if you have any questions, please put them into the questions and answer box at the bottom of the screen. So moving through the rest of these slides, I see that the next one we have here, I wasn't sure what this was.
Well, this is an interesting artifact. It was hand carved by George Frank in the 1860s. He was a Union soldier captured and in a Confederate war camp. And he got scraps of wood and carved 70 individual Masonic representations from our ritual. And when he got back home to the Terre Haute area, he configured these into this montage. So this is a hand-carved piece of Masonic art made by an Indiana Hoosier while he was a prisoner of war in a Confederate Civil War camp. And this has been on display at the War Memorial on 2 separate occasions, and it is documented. So we're very fortunate to have this very unique Hoosier piece of art done during the Civil War. The next slide has an interesting story. These are officers' jewels that officers would wear during the meeting to denote their position in the lodge. And these jewels belong to Versailles Lodge. And during the Civil War, Colonel Morgan from the Confederacy, leading Morgan's Raiders, comes up through Kentucky and Indiana and over into Ohio. And when he comes through Versailles, they were called Morgan's Raiders because they weren't supplied. They had to appropriate what they needed. And they broke in the Masonic Lodge, and these are sterling silver officers' jewels, and the soldiers stole them. When they got back to camp and they're all comparing their booty, Colonel Morgan, who was a Mason, recognized them for what they were and ordered them to be returned to the lodge the next day. So Morgan's raiders stole and returned the officers' jewels to Versailles Lodge in southern Indiana during the Civil War. A great Masonic story, because the Colonel Morgan upheld his Masonic loyalty, even though he was in Northern Territory.
Yeah, they're very beautiful. And yeah, just the fact that it was silver, that they were taken by raiders, and then that he would return them the next day, which I can imagine would only be just a little awkward to after your temple had been looted and then having these returned. But that's still really nice that he remembered his oath and returned these, calling them jewels, officer jewels, returning these jewels to the lodge where they came from.
These were handmade by a member of the lodge at that time, and he used French silver francs and melted those down to form the jewels. So these are handmade jewels from the mid 1800s.
We're about to get to
go ahead.
We're about to get to our question and answer section, but I do want to get to this last artifact that we have.
Okay.
This is the Fredericksburg Lodge Washington Bible.
So this is a Masonic Bible? This is not on display. This is a King James Bible, but it was used on the altar of Fredericksburg Lodge the day that George Washington took his obligations as an entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason on 3 separate occasions. So we were very fortunate. This has never left their lodge, and they loaned this to our museum for our 200th anniversary a couple years ago now. And we had this on display. So we were very fortunate to have the very Bible that George Washington placed his hands on when he took his obligation as a master mason.
That's truly impressive. All right, moving on to our questions. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We're going to start with Anita Dansker. Do you need to be invited or nominated to join the Masons?
Chris, take that one.
In the United States, it was a long-standing requirement that a Mason could not invite someone to join. And many of our members over the years became so obsessive about following that, you would hear story after story of fathers and grandfathers that would walk around for much of their life with a folded petition in their pocket, just waiting for their son to ask about joining, and the son never asked, and the father or the grandfather couldn't bring him into lodge because he didn't ask. In other parts of the world, it is exactly the opposite. In England, it was a long-standing requirement that if you asked, you wouldn't be let in, that you had to be invited to join by the lodge. There's no right way or wrong way. It's just the way they developed in different countries. So the real answer is both are true, just depending on where you are. In Indiana, we passed rules several times that were loosening these requirements. Weren't allowed to advertise, or even say, come by the lodge if you're interested in, joining. You couldn't even go so far as to say that. And so some little genius in probably the early 1960s came up with basically a little hieroglyphic that said the number 2 and the letter B and the number 1. And then had a square and compass, and then ask one. To be one, ask a Mason, basically, is what it was saying. But you didn't come right out and say that. And so it was kind of a dodge around, but it was a little obscure for people anyway. And so, yes, for quite some time now, we've been able to ask.
Okay. Here's a question from our next guest, which is Scott T. Are there plans to incorporate any Indiana African-American Freemason artifacts into your collection?
Well, I just attended Prince Hall's Grand Lodge this last weekend, and we had a long discussion about that very thing. We do have some exhibits on Prince Hall Freemasonry, and we have done several things together, our mutual Grand Lodges. But yes, Prince Hall is now looking for artifacts to loan to us so we can have a more extensive display about Black or Prince Hall Freemasonry in Indiana, which goes back to the 1850s.
This is from Anita Dansker. Were men from some religions prohibited from becoming a Mason?
The only requirement is you must believe in God, and it must be a monotheistic God. So there are several recognized religions that are acceptable. You do not have to be Christian per se, but you do have to believe in a monotheistic religion and that there is a universal God of the universe. And so in Freemason, we refer to that as the grand architect of the universe, which is a more universal way not to exclude or offend any religion.
All right. It's very good to know.
Most of the restrictions about joining concerning religions specifically have come the other way. The Roman Catholic Church long has forbidden their members to join the Freemasons, not the other way around, but for a variety of philosophical, religious, and political reasons over the years. Almost since the beginnings of the fraternity, of the modern fraternity, first the Catholic encyclical was in like 1737 that forbids it. And things are sort of wishy-washy about that today. Certain divisions of the Lutheran Church forbid it. For many, many years, the Mormon Church forbade their members from joining. It is generally not the other way around. Freemasonry actually was unique when it first became known about in England, in London. I believe it was 1732 was the first case of Jewish members showing up in London lodges, which was unheard of for a voluntary associative organization. Here you are less than 100 years away from a major religious bloody revolution in England, fought over religion. And here they are having Masonic lodges with Catholic and Protestant and Anglican and Jewish religions all sitting side by side. One of the fascinating aspects of the fraternity is if you go to the website for the Grand Lodge of Israel, for instance, their official seal of the Grand Lodge contains the Christian cross, the Hebrew Star of David, and the crescent of Islam. And in fact, they pride themselves in that every time when they elect a new Grand Master, they rotate between a Christian and a Jew and a Muslim. And so, it was deliberately designed to welcome men of all faiths and all beliefs.
All right. So these next two questions we're going to combine together. How many Masonic lodges were built in Indiana, and how many are still open?
We have had probably no more than about 550 lodges operating at any one time, although we have 756 lodge numbers. So at one time or another, there have been 750 lodges formed in Indiana. We've never had probably much more than 550 at any one time. So an example would be a lodge forms in a small town. And now society has changed and there literally aren't enough people in that little community to support a lodge. So those members would move their membership to the next closest lodge. They generally would not drop out. They would just re-affiliate to the next closest place. So today we have in around 400 lodges, but technically we've had 750 formed in the state of Indiana.
Okay. Our next question comes from Mark Hayworth. Can you tell us more about the library and in particular any significant volumes contained within?
The library has about 5,000 Masonic volumes. We do have a section on Indiana history but primarily our collection is Masonic books. And as I said, we have about 5,000 books. It is cataloged in a card catalog fashion. Nobody uses that anymore, and we are working on getting that changed into a digital format. And we've actually scanned many of our older pieces so they can be shared digitally as well. But we need to have an electronic cataloging system that people would be more comfortable using today.
You know, it's funny, when I started getting my degree in history, it was required for us to learn how to use the old Dewey Decimal Systems and microfilm. And I will admit, computers are just way better. Digital collections really help with just accessing it much quicker.
One of the challenges of any Masonic library is that in the Dewey Decimal System, the entire subject of Freemasonry is contained within about 2 decimal point numbers. And yet, Masonic libraries will have thousands of different volumes devoted to the fraternity. And so over the years, not 1, not 2, but 3 different Masonic small library numbering cataloging systems have been developed over the last couple of 100 years. And so consequently, there's not a lot of uniformity around the country as to how specifically Masonic libraries are numbered. So we're in the process of converting over and trying to, basically, we're going to have to renumber all of our volumes. And that's an ongoing project that we're hoping very hard this year that we finally have got some help that's going to be able to move that project forward.
All right, well, we've only got about a few minutes left, so I'm just going to go through. We've got a couple of questions remaining. Do you recall any popular movies that gets Freemasonry very right, or any movies that get it very wrong?
Chris, this would be your topic.
Okay. Movies that get it wrong, probably 99% of them. National Treasure was one of the very few instances where the Freemasons were actually the good guys in the end. I hope I haven't ruined it for anybody who hasn't seen it. That never happens. Usually the Freemasons are treated like bald-headed, cat-stroking supervillains behind the scenes. And yeah, I mean, From Hell was sort of a notorious one that makes the claim that Freemasons were behind the Jack the Ripper murders of women in London in the 1870s. As a matter of fact, there are 2 movies that were based on that story. One's called From Hell, based on the famous graphic novel. The other is called Murder by Decree, which is treated as a Sherlock Holmes story. But there were actual Masons involved in the Ripper story. The chief of police was a very well-known Mason at the time. But no, there's no truth to that story at all. A rousing movie beloved by most Masons is The Man Who Would Be King, with Michael Caine and Sean Connery. And it's a wonderful adventure story that was written by Freemason. For heaven's sake, how did his name go right out of my head? Kipling, thank you. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story. Unfortunately, the 2 characters, they're pretty much ne'er-do-wells, and they capitalize on their Masonic membership in the course of the story. But it's a wonderful story. But no, they don't get Freemasonry quite right in that either. They use it to take advantage of people. But no, there really and truly are not many that do. You'll get lots of situations where they'll do a parody of a lodge. Infamously, the Stonecutters episode of The Simpsons is the one that most people immediately think of.
That song is now stuck in my head.
See, there you go. And well, we do. So there you go. And, but yeah, there really and truly, there aren't. I can't think of a movie that actually gets it right. That got really in wide popular release.
All right, well, we have time for just one more question, and this is from Gene. Is it once a Mason, always a Mason, or are there required annual dues?
Yes, there are required annual dues. No, we don't capture your soul or anything like that. If you join and you decide that it's not for you, that's perfectly fine. You walk into a meeting or you send a letter to the lodge secretary saying you would not like to be a Mason anymore, and they will grant you what's called a demit. That is basically a certificate that says if you change your mind at some point in the future and want to come back, you can do that. You were in good standing when you left, and so good luck with whatever you choose to do from now on. So no, you're not held to something, for life, and if you try and get out of it, you can't, or anything like that. Not at all.
And I might add that something kind of unique to Freemasonry, most members voluntarily stay members for life. Most organizations have kind of a 7-year life cycle, and their membership turns over with some regularity. Most Freemasons do choose to stay members for life, but Chris is exactly right. It's not an obligation. You may ask for a demit or leave of your own choice.
All right, well, and with that, I want to thank you both for joining us here tonight, and thank you for our audience for listening in. Before we go, where can we find the museum and what are its hours?
The museum's located at 525 North Illinois Street, and in the Grand Lodge building called Freemasons Hall. It's directly across North Street from the Scottish Rite Cathedral, another major landmark in Indianapolis. The Scottish Rite, of course, is a Masonic building as well. The museum is located on the 5th floor of Freemasons Hall, and we are open 5 days a week from 10 o'clock till 4 o'clock, and we would welcome visitors at any time.
Right, and Chris, you wrote a book called what? Freemasons for Dummies. Where can we find that?
Why, that's supposed to be in bookstores everywhere, and it always isn't, but I'd like it to be. And you can order it from Amazon. It's available in e-versions. There's an audio book version of it. Yeah, I wrote that back in 2004 and 2005, and it just keeps going like gangbusters. It's now been translated into 7 or 8 foreign languages around the world, and I'm both honored and humbled by the reception that it's received over the last almost 20 years now. 20 years, really? Wow.
Yeah. And I might add, even though the title makes it sound like it's not a serious work, this is reviewed and revered by Masons all over the world. It's really an excellent primer to what Freemasonry is.
Well, I have to admit, I really want to check out a copy now. All right. Michael and Chris, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Like I said, this was very informative. I learned a lot about Indiana history. I also just the fact that not just the famous, people that like historical figures, but also just something like Dave Thomas, how President Truman came all the way to Indiana was he a brother before he joined, or just an initiate, or I don't know the proper term. The lodge.
Well, Harry Truman was a member, but he came.
I meant the seaman.
He was joining. He was getting his 3rd degree, his Master Mason degree, at Beech Grove Lodge. So okay. He and Harry had talked about his other degrees, and Harry had been a mentor to him while this young man was giving Harry physical therapy.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, and to our audience, thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this program, we hope you'll consider coming back for more. Our next History Happy Hour is next month with the History of the Written Word with our guest, Tamara Hemmerline. And then in September, we will be discussing Indiana in the Cold War with our guest, Zoe Horndran. You can sign up for these events both in person and virtual at www.indianahistory.org/visit/calendar. We will post this conversation to the IHS YouTube channel in the coming weeks. In the meantime, if you'd like to revisit any of our previous free programs, you can check it out at the History Happy Hour playlist on YouTube or at the link in the chat. If you missed your chance to donate or like to make a further gift to support the Indiana Historical Society, please visit indianahistory.org/contribute/donate. Your donation will allow us to continue to share Hoosier stories and help fund programs just like this one. You will be prompted at the close of the webinar to take a 1-minute survey. We'd love to know what you thought and what topics you may be interested in learning about. And as always, thank you again for joining us. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Good night.
Right.